Hi folks, this video is going to be essentially myself guiding you through the report writing assignment sheet. Now I realize that the primary focus of this coming week in class, if you are watching this when it's first being offered, is going to be the revision of your peer editing and your revision of your annotated bibliography. I am 100% aware of that, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce to you the report writing assignment in its full glory or lack thereof, depending on your perspective, so that you can understand the trajectory. You can understand where what's going to happen, where you're going with the information gathered and collated and expounded upon and so forth in your annotated bibliography. What are you going to do with it, right? What's the purpose? Okay, so this is the first purpose of having gone through the process of creating your annotated bibliography, is to apply it to the report. So yes, ideally what you're going to do is you're going to use the information that you have compiled with your annotated bibliography to help you create your report. So I'm going to fast forward through a lot of this. The first point that I want to make is that of audience. You need to be keenly aware when you're creating your report to whom you're writing, right? Why this particular audience, and what stake do they have in this information that you're providing? In other words, why should they care about it? And more of this as we move along. Okay. Again, I'm not going to read through this verbatim, in part because you all are intelligent, undoubtedly more intelligent than I am in many respects, and in many aspects. So you all can read through this. I'm just going to try to help clarify some points. So think about the following, right? Who's your audience? What type of language and rhetorical convention would best hold their interest, right? So to whom are you writing? And what kind of phraseology, what kind of language, what kind of metaphor, etc., are they going to respond to, right? For example, you would not attract a 12-year-old the same way that you would attract a 40-year-old in most cases, unless that 40-year-old happened to be a gamer that hung out with a lot of 12-year-olds online. Well, let's not go there. But in any case, with a 12-year-old, you might mention, Fortnite, you might mention Post Malone, so on and so forth. I'm probably, I don't know if Post Malone's still cool or not anymore. So, but anyway, the point is you would use a different means to appeal to a different audience, right? So key terms and concepts related to your research that your audience may not know, that your audience may need clarification about. Now, please understand this point. I don't want anyone to just copy terms from a dictionary. Don't do that. That, number one, that defeats the purpose of what you're doing in the report, the intellectual exercise, right? It defeats the purpose of it. Number two, most of you are going to use dictionaries. If I gave you that option, you would use dictionaries that are entirely inappropriate, not by fault of your own, but because you wouldn't know any better. Okay, for example, in most cases, 99.9% of the cases, it is not advisable or appropriate to quote from something like Webster's, for example, when you're dealing with an educated audience. Why? Because Webster's is a very general dictionary, right? Now, if you pulled out, Black's Law and you were dealing with issues of policy, something that might be something else. But for the purposes of this project, do not quote dictionary definitions. Okay? What I want you to do is, when thinking back on your research and thinking about those key terms, and what I mean by key terms is not stuff that, your audience would know for granted, right? Not common knowledge, but really terms within your research that have a specific definition. Maybe it's a commonly used term, but it's a definition specific to the context of your research, or maybe it's a term that no one in your particular audience has touched upon before. Okay, your task is this. Okay, use familiar terms, ideas, terms, images, etc., that are familiar to your audience to describe that which is unfamiliar. Okay, so what you're doing is you're making the unfamiliar familiar by way of familiar terms. For example, if I were to tell you, hey, I stopped and talked with someone that looked like Peter Griffin, right? Even if you're not a fan of a Family Guy, right? By way of popular culture, you know what Peter Griffin looks like. And so immediately you have an image that pops in your head about probably what this individual that I spoke with, I'm telling you that I spoke with, looks like. Okay? That's an example of using the familiar to describe the unfamiliar. Okay? That's what I want you to do in terms of definition of terms. Okay? So also think about, and again, we're just talking about pre-writing here. We're just talking about invention here. Think about, and again, it may behoove you, incidentally, to type all this out. Not that you're going to turn it in with your draft necessarily, but you can use it as evidence of invention in your folio, for example, which I'll talk more about folio in an upcoming video, and so on, and there'll be materials on that. Okay, but any kind of invention that you do throughout the term, you want to hold on to, right? So, point being, think about your stance on the topic based on your research, right? Think about that, okay? All right. Know how you feel about it. Okay, and think about how you might articulate that. Very important point, though. Moving on to the next page, the primary goal of this report is not for you to argue your position. That's not what you're doing here. You are synthesizing information. You are synthesizing information. In other words, you're giving an overview of the major discourse or conversations surrounding the topic that you looked at, right? And that's what you're doing. You're synthesizing that information. Okay, such that you're trying, in a way, you're trying to make your expertise that you have gathered by way of your annotated bibliography, you're trying to make that expertise accessible to your given audience, okay, through this report. In so doing, I would encourage you, and I'll have sample reports and stuff available to you in the probably next week, probably week 5, okay, but I would encourage you to use subject headings, within your report. Again, to guide the reader, you want the buzzword, if you will, the hashtag, if you will, is reader friendly, right? The whole purpose, right, behind an audience reading a report is to synthesize that information, make that information digestible, right? Okay, that's what you're doing here, okay? You are going to be expected to integrate quotations, etc., from your annotated bibliography. I mean, not from the annotated bibliography itself, but from the sources that you looked at to create your annotated bibliography. That's why I asked you to do the running notes with quotations and explanations of the quotations and so forth, because something like that, invention exercises like that, pre-writing like that, is going to come in absolutely to be very essential for this project as well as the next. Okay? Keep in mind that your responsibility as an essayist, and indeed where your creativity, your ingenuity come into play largely, is when you explain the relationship between the material that you're quoting or citing, okay, and the point that you're trying to make, okay? That liminal space, that's where you fill that liminal space with your creative connections. You bridge that gap. That's what you're doing as an essayist. You're bridging that gap. Your creativity is the electricity between that synapse, right? That's what you're doing. So now, I've provided for you here a very, very basic outline form, okay? What I would do, this is how I would structure the report if I were doing it, okay? I'm not saying you're 100% wed to this, okay? But if I were doing it, this is my own, as far as my own structuring of a report, this is what I would do, and this is what I'm offering to you, okay? So state your research question. What is it that you researched, okay? Why did you research it? And why and how is the research question important to your specific audience, right? Now, I would include all of this, the first three, okay, in an introduction. And in fact, I have it later on down in this doc, all that later on down in this document. So I'll hold off on that. But it's very important to identify your audience specifically and to tell them why they should care about this. Okay, now for some of you, that's fairly easy. If you're doing if you're working on COVID, for example, and COVID in Texas, that's fairly easy, right? 120,000 Americans, last time I looked, have now succumbed to this illness. So it's fairly easy to argue why it's important, right? Okay. What I was talking about before, define any unfamiliar terms or concepts, okay? Provide a synthesis of the information. This number 5 is going to be the vast majority of your essay. Number 6 and 7, so at this point, after you give your synthesis, you can talk about your own position here, right? But your own position is not privileged in the essay. Your own position is not in the forefront, right? Your own position is not first, okay? But you can, as the essay concludes, talk about your own position and briefly, talk about why. Why do you have this position, right? That's going to flow into the final the final essay for the class, the argument essay. But yeah, you can talk about your position towards the end. As I said, buzzword is reader friendly. So, as I also said, your introduction should be 1 to 3 above, right? So in your introductory paragraph, I would include the elements of points 1 to 3. Definition of terms would be point 4. That should be its own section. And again, I've already explained the purpose of that and what I'm asking you to do for that. Number 5, and I cannot emphasize this enough. This is going to be the bulk of your essay. You really need a synthesis that is at least somewhere around 2 pages long, if not longer, because that is the report. In essence, your synthesis is the report. Okay, and you need to correctly and appropriately cite sources in that synthesis. And then an opinion section that would encompass points 6 and 7. Okay, and again, I would label these sections, right? Introduction, definition of terms, synthesis, opinion, right? I would label all this, right? I would make it evident, right? Reader friendly. Now, I have put in here what is to follow is a discussion about integrating sources, and these are techniques that you can use. You can essentially take these techniques through various courses and apply them regardless of the course. Now, in terms of genre that you're writing, the genre itself might call for different approaches, but the integration of sources, the concept is basically the same. These examples here use primarily MLA, in-text citation, but the techniques involved are pretty much universal. So the examples below, particularly with a thesis statement, those are examples for an argumentative thesis, which is not really going to come into play for you all until the argument project. But I went ahead and included this here because it's an important concept for you to understand, and in 99.9% of your cases, you've already covered this in high school, 1301, in your history class, and so forth. By the time you get to 1302, you've probably already covered argumentative thesis to some degree, but this is by way of review and emphasis. So, but understand, this assignment, the report writing assignment, is not asking for an argumentative thesis, okay? As I explained here. So, when dealing with an argumentative thesis, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this right now because that's not the focus of this assignment again, but when dealing with an argumentative thesis, it's very important to understand the difference between a thesis and an observation, right? An observation would be, if I were to look outside right now, as I'm doing, you can't see me doing it, but if I were to say, ooh, the sky is blue, right? Most rational people, their response will be, no shit, right? If your statement can be answered in any way by the phrase "no shit," that's not a thesis, right? Because it's an observation, right? Okay, there's no intellectual rigor or questioning or thinking involved in that. You just look and you see, well, no shit, right? So keep that in mind. A thesis must pass the no shit test. because a thesis can actually be argued. If I were to say the sky is blue because, or rather, if I were to say I perceive the sky is blue because of various parts of my anatomy or the way that my eyes reflect light and so on and so on and so forth, all of that can be supported or refuted using evidence. So that statement would be much closer to a thesis than the sky is blue. Thesis comes from the same root as theory, theology, and so on. A thesis implies a theory, right? A thesis presents a theory, right? So just keep that in mind, okay? And this example here, I'm not going to read through all of it, but this example here is from the novel Secret Life of Bees. You don't need to know anything about the novel Secret Life of Bees to glean the technique out of this. I will read some of this with you because it's very important and it's the crux of what I'm trying to get at here. Most inexperienced writers have a tendency to want to quote large portions in text, but in essays as brief as the ones we're writing here, not only is this not practical, to a certain degree it's a cop-out. Quote only the specific language in the text that best supports your ideas. Conform the syntax of the quote to the syntax of your sentence. Pause for a moment. What's syntax? If you're a computer science person, you're probably familiar with the term syntax error. That's order of words or order of characters. Okay, so syntax has to do with the ordering of words. Okay, or the ordering of characters, so on and so forth. Right, ordering of letters and so forth. Okay. To do this, use ellipses, the three dots, to indicate omitted text, and use brackets to indicate that you've either added text for emphasis or to adjust the syntax. Consider the following example. Note that in the example, I both introduce the quote and explicate or explain the quote using language of the quote itself. There's far more about this to follow in this document. Throughout most of the novel, Lily frames August as the queen bee. Pause. Now, this is the point that I'm trying to make here. I've made an assertion. So now I'm going to state something from the text that supports this assertion. Right? When they visit Zach in jail, she comments. Now, comments functions as a signal phrase. Further down in this document, you'll begin to understand what a signal will be introduced to signal phrases. The fire in August eyes. Note here, the fire in August eyes is in brackets. This is because I added it, okay, to be clear about the antecedent of it, okay? Typically speaking, you never want to have it without an antecedent, okay, in an essay, unless it's a creative essay, or if the it is implicitly understood by your audience. Was the hearth fire you could depend on, you could draw up to and get warm by if you were cold, or cook something on that would feed the emptiness in you. Now note here, this is an ellipsis followed by a period, right? Or rather, I'm sorry, it's a period followed by an ellipsis. This indicates that, and if you look at the actual edition of the novel that I use for this, there's like a page of description that goes on before I hit the next part of this quotation. But I don't need it, right, to make my point, so I don't use it. All we had was the wet fire in August eyes, but it was enough. Now this is MLA in-text citation. More on that to follow, and there'll be, of course, some examples. In terms of archetype, The hearth is intrinsically related to motherhood as a locus of nurturing and safety. Lily equates this hearth fire with the grounding because a fire affects the chemical change just as August is affecting the change within Lily. August's eyes are mirrors through which Lily spies the Mary within August that has yet to awaken within herself. Now, what I've done here is I have made a statement or an assertion. I've given a quotation from the text and context, and I have explained the relationship between that assertion and the quotation that I used. Okay, you should not have a quotation or cite from a source, etc., without explaining the significance or meaning of that source as it applies to what you are doing. Okay, because rhetorically speaking, to do so would be to not do so would be moot, right? The use of your source is essentially moot if you don't talk about what that source means in the context that you're using it, right? Think about those of you who have younger children or who have had younger children, who have younger siblings or nieces or nephews, right? The 2-year-old, the 3-year-old, why, right? That's what you should keep in mind when you are quoting source material, right? Always the why, always the why, always the what and the why, right? Have that little 3-year-old voice or 2-year-old voice in your head running, okay? I'm probably traumatizing some of you because some of you probably are having flashbacks to, your 2 or your 3-year-old or your little cousin or whatever. But my point is that you always need to talk about the significance of the source. If you don't talk about the significance of the source, you shouldn't quote the source in the first place. Okay? All right. So, direct quotation is not your only option, and it absolutely shouldn't be your only option. Only use direct quotation when the quotation, as is indicated above, when the quotation is necessary, right, for the meaning of what you're talking about, the actual language or the actual statistics, etc., whatever it is necessary for to convey the meaning. And if you're going to specifically talk about that language or those numbers, etc., if you're going to specifically talk about it when you're conveying that meaning, then you quote it directly. Otherwise, you have other options, right? So, summary is, most of you know this. You've had these terms for, in some cases, decades, right? This is by way of review. So summary involves broad strokes. Paraphrase is specific, right? But it also has to be restated. And I don't mean just like changing a few words around. Again, very much like the defining of terms I was talking about earlier, you restate what is stated. You restate the specific information that was restated using your own familiar terminology, right? And then direct quotation. Now, all three of these options for integrating sources require you to use in-text citation. Any concept or idea, right, that is not yours, right? Any intellectual property that is not yours and that is not common knowledge should be cited parenthetically. What do I mean by parenthetical citation? If you look at the above example, the Sue Monk Kid example from Secret Life of Bees, that's an example of in-text citation, okay? So, signal phrasing, and I give some examples. Here's some very common signal verbs. The list is actually endless. I invite you to look through this. Very valuable information. Running acknowledgement, also very valuable. And please do look through this. Now, really important websites. Please look at these websites if you're doing either APA or MLA with regard to in-text citation. I personally don't know if I could explain it better than what they do. Okay, so please do that. And the key point with your citation and so forth is to be consistent. If you've got an APA works cited page, you need to have APA in-text citation, okay? And there is a difference between APA and MLA in-text citation, as these websites will point out to you, okay? So this, in a nutshell, is the report writing assignment. Obviously, there's going to be more to come on this. This is the basic beginning, if you will. So I invite any questions. Obviously, I'll be mentioning it in my announcements as we move forward, and so on. Okay, but I wanted you to go ahead and see this information and become acquainted with it so that you could see where we're going with the annotated bibliography. Why did we spend so much time on it? What was the purpose? Incidentally, in the report, you're not going to use, I'm not expecting you to use all 10 of your sources, okay? In your report, which will roughly be 4 or 5 pages, right, with about 2 to 3 pages of synthesis, you may use 4, you may use 6 sources. I'm not expecting you to use all 10, in part because some of those sources are going to be of higher quality than other sources, and some of the sources are going to retread information, right? That's part of the purpose of evaluating the quality of the source as a part of your annotated bibliography, because going into this report what your best sources are, right? What I don't want to see is what I've seen over the past couple of semesters, which has been, I'm going to do my report, I'm only going to use 2 sources. That is not a synthesis, right? The use of 2 sources is not a synthesis. That is not a responsible look at what's going on in a given topic, right? Even at something as brief as like a 2-page synthesis. 4 sources, okay. 6 sources, great. More than that, fantastic, okay? But really, again, the key term here is effort, right? I want to see your effort, evidence of your effort. I don't want to see, again, y'all know what I'm talking about, okay? Have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks a lot.